I stood in my living room staring at my wife Sarah as she pointed her finger inches from my face, her voice echoing off the walls like a battle cry. Behind her, her 17-year-old son Brandon crossed his arms with that same smug expression he always wore when Mommy came to his rescue. $2,000 had vanished from my office safe money I desperately needed for my sister's cancer treatment, and the evidence pointed straight to the kid who suddenly owned brand new gaming equipment worth exactly that amount. Sarah's ultimatum cut through the air like a knife apologized to Brandon for falsely accusing him or face divorce papers by morning. 6 months earlier, everything seemed perfect when I married Sarah Collins at the little chapel outside Denver. I was 34, running my own construction company, and thought I'd found the missing piece of my life. Sarah was this beautiful, confident real estate agent whose car had broken down right outside one of my job sites on a scorching July afternoon. I offered to help, she offered to buy me dinner, and before I knew it, we were planning a future together. What drew me in wasn't just Sarah's laugh or the way she made even mundane conversations feel electric. It was the idea of becoming a father figure to Brandon, helping shape a young man who seemed to need guidance. Sarah painted this picture of us as this perfect blended family, and I bought into it completely. Looking back, maybe I was so eager to have a family that I ignored the warning signs scattered like broken glass along our path. The first red flag appeared during our engagement when Brandon would make these subtle comments about my truck being older than his friends' cars, or how our restaurant choices weren't upscale enough for his taste. When I'd suggest family activities like hiking or going to baseball games, he'd roll his eyes and find excuses to stay home. Sarah always defended him, explaining that he was just adjusting to having a new man in their lives. After our wedding, I decided to install a fireproof safe in my home office. Running a construction business meant keeping important contracts, insurance documents, and emergency cash secure. I chose a heavy-duty model that could withstand both fire and theft attempts. The combination was something only 3 people knew: myself, Sarah, and my business partner Jake Williams, who sometimes needed access to important paperwork when I was out on job sites. Sarah seemed supportive when I explained my reasoning, even suggesting we keep some of her important documents there too. She said it made her feel secure, knowing our valuables were protected. What I didn't realize was how that security would become the very thing that would tear our marriage apart. My sister Emma called me on a Tuesday morning in October, her voice shaking with tears I'd never heard before. The doctors had found an aggressive form of cancer, and while her insurance covered standard treatments, there was an experimental therapy that could significantly improve her survival chances. The problem was, the cost $20,000 up front with $2,000 needed immediately just to secure her spot in the program. Emma had always been the strong one in our family, the person everyone turned to during tough times. Hearing her breakdown over the phone shattered something inside me. I promised her I'd handle the money, knowing I had exactly enough saved for emergencies like this. That $2,000 represented months of careful saving, putting aside money from every successful project completion. When I went to retrieve the cash 3 days later, my stomach dropped like I'd fallen off a building. The safe was properly locked, showing no signs of tampering. But inside the neat stacks of 20s, and hundreds I'd organized, were simply gone. Everything else remained untouched: our marriage certificate, my business insurance papers, even Sarah's grandmother's jewelry she'd stored there. I called Sarah immediately, my voice probably sounding more panicked than I intended. Her response caught me off guard. Instead of concern or surprise, she became defensive almost immediately, asking why I was checking the safe and whether I suspected her of something. When I explained about Emma's medical emergency and the missing money, she went quiet for a long moment before suggesting maybe I'd miscounted or moved the money somewhere else. That evening, Brandon came home with 3 large boxes from an electronics store, struggling to carry them all upstairs to his room. When I asked what he'd bought, he mumbled something about saving up from his part-time job at the movie theater. Sarah quickly changed the subject, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I did the math. Brandon's movie theater job paid minimum wage for maybe 15 hours per week. After taxes and the gas money he constantly asked Sarah for, there was no way he could afford the $1,500 gaming setup I'd seen him unboxing. When I brought this up to Sarah, she exploded. She accused me of being paranoid and controlling, of treating Brandon like a criminal instead of a family member. According to her, I was so obsessed with money that I couldn't see past my own suspicions. She reminded me that Brandon was just a teenager trying to fit in with his friends, and that my constant questioning was driving a wedge between us. But the evidence was right there in front of us. Brandon had expensive new possessions. The exact amount of money was missing from a safe only 3 people could access, and his behavior had shifted from merely disrespectful to openly defiant. When I suggested we simply ask Brandon directly about the money, Sarah's reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't deny that Brandon had taken the money. Instead, she justified it. According to Sarah, Brandon deserved nice things after years of his father providing minimal child support. She argued that families should share everything, and that my attachment to keeping money locked away was evidence of deeper trust issues. Then came the revelation that made my blood run cold. Sarah had given Brandon the safe combination 3 weeks earlier, believing that family members shouldn't keep secrets from each other. She'd presented it as a gesture of trust and inclusion, never considering that maybe a 17-year-old shouldn't have unlimited access to thousands of dollars in cash. When I pointed out that the money was specifically saved for Emma's medical treatment, Sarah's response was that Brandon's happiness mattered too, and that families needed to prioritize the people living under their roof. Standing in our living room that night with Sarah demanding I apologize to Brandon for even questioning him about the theft, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about right and wrong, about teaching consequences, about whether our marriage could survive when we held completely different values about honesty and accountability. Brandon stood behind his mother with this expression of smug satisfaction, clearly enjoying watching an adult get scolded on his behalf. Sarah's face was flushed with righteous anger, her finger still pointing at me like I was the villain in this situation. The absurdity of being asked to apologize for accurately identifying theft would have been funny if my sister's life didn't hang in the balance. I looked directly at Sarah, keeping my voice calm and steady, and said 3 words that changed everything. Find another husband. The color drained from her face as if I'd slapped her. Brandon's smug expression faltered for the first time. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, probably expecting me to argue or negotiate, but I was already walking toward the door. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's manipulation. I drove straight to Jake's house, knowing he'd still be awake working on project estimates in his garage workshop. Jake Williams had been my business partner for 8 years, and we'd weathered economic downturns, difficult clients, and supply chain nightmares together. If anyone could help me think clearly, it was him. When I explained what had happened, Jake's reaction surprised me. He didn't seem shocked at all. Instead, he revealed that Sarah had been calling him over the past few weeks, asking detailed questions about our business finances, client contracts, and future projects. She'd presented these conversations as innocent curiosity about my work, but now they took on a much more sinister tone. Jake had found her questions odd because she'd never shown interest in the construction business before, and some of her inquiries were surprisingly specific about profit margins and asset valuations. He'd answered politely but vaguely, assuming she was just trying to understand my career better. Now we both realized she'd been gathering information for reasons that had nothing to do with marital support. I checked into a hotel that night, and my phone immediately exploded with text messages from Sarah. The first few were angry, calling me childish for walking out during an important conversation. Then they became accusatory, claiming I was abandoning my family over money and proving I never really cared about Brandon. By midnight, she was sending messages every few minutes, ranging from threats to bargaining to emotional manipulation. The next day, Sarah launched a campaign that I hadn't seen coming. She called her sister Monica, her mother Patricia, and several mutual friends, painting herself as the victim of a controlling husband who'd accused her innocent son of theft without evidence. According to her version of events, I was financially abusive, keeping money locked away from my own family while lavishing expensive tools and equipment on my business. Brandon took things further by posting on social media about his abusive stepdad, who attacks innocent kids and makes family life miserable with constant suspicion and control. His post gained traction among his friends and their parents, many of whom knew Sarah through her real estate work. Within hours, I was being portrayed as the villain in a story where a concerned mother was protecting her son from an unreasonable stepfather. The social media campaign had real consequences at work. Several of my subcontractors started asking uncomfortable questions about my character, wondering if the family drama indicated deeper problems with my judgment or reliability. One long-term client even called Jake privately to express concerns about continuing our business relationship while I was dealing with personal issues that were becoming public. But Sarah wasn't finished. While I was at work the next day, she went to the bank and emptied our joint checking account, leaving exactly $50 behind. The account had contained nearly $8,000 money we'd been saving for home improvements and vacation plans. She also called a locksmith and changed all the locks on our house, effectively barring me from my own property. When I arrived home that evening to find my key didn't work, I felt something between rage and bewilderment. This was my house, purchased before our marriage with my name alone on the deed. Sarah's actions were not just vindictive, they were illegal, but they also showed me exactly who I was dealing with. I called David Thompson, a divorce attorney Jake had recommended, and scheduled an emergency consultation. David was a no-nonsense lawyer in his 50s who'd handled hundreds of divorce cases involving blended families and financial disputes. His first question was whether I had documentation proving the house was my separate property, which fortunately I did. David explained that Sarah could not legally prevent me from entering my own home regardless of our marital status. He also noted that emptying joint accounts without discussion could be viewed unfavorably by divorce courts, especially when one spouse was trying to access funds for a family medical emergency. But then he shared something that made my situation even more complex. David had seen cases where spouses gathered financial information and created paper trails to support claims of financial abuse or control. Sarah's questions to Jake, combined with her recent actions, suggested she might be building a legal strategy rather than simply reacting emotionally to our argument. This wasn't just a family dispute, it was potentially the opening move in a calculated divorce proceeding. Emma called again that night, her voice weaker than before. The experimental treatment program had a strict timeline, and other patients were waiting for available slots. If I couldn't provide the initial $2,000 payment within 48 hours, she'd lose her opportunity and have to rely on conventional treatments with much lower success rates. I spent that night in the hotel room staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 3 days earlier, I'd been a happily married man planning home improvement projects and thinking about maybe starting a family with Sarah. Now, I was facing divorce, character assassination, and the possibility that my sister might die because I couldn't access money that a teenage thief had stolen with his mother's blessing. The next morning brought the most devastating revelation yet. I discovered that Sarah had been secretly recording our conversations for weeks using a voice recording app on her phone. Jake found out when Sarah called him again, accidentally revealing that she had recordings of me admitting to financial control and emotional manipulation. What she actually had were recordings of normal conversations taken completely out of context, edited to make me sound unreasonable and controlling. Sarah had been planning this confrontation for much longer than I'd realized, gathering evidence and building her case while pretending everything was fine. The fight about Brandon stealing money wasn't the cause of our marriage's breakdown. It was simply the trigger for a plan she'd already put in motion. The next morning, I returned to my house with a police escort to collect my belongings, exercising my legal right to enter my own property. What I found inside was worse than I'd imagined. The living room looked like a tornado had hit it with furniture, moved around my personal items, scattered, and clear evidence that multiple people had been staying there overnight. Sarah had turned my home into a headquarters for what she called her support gathering. Her entire family was present, her mother Patricia, her sister Monica. her brother-in-law Steve, and even her aunt Linda, who lived 2 hours away in Colorado Springs. They'd clearly been briefed on Sarah's version of events because they all looked at me like I was some kind of domestic abuser who'd finally been caught. Brandon was lounging on my leather recliner like he owned the place, wearing a brand new designer hoodie that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Around him were empty pizza boxes, soda cans, and clear evidence that he'd been hosting friends while I was locked out of my own house. My 60-inch television was moved to a different wall, several of my framed photographs were missing, and there were mysterious stains on my carpet that definitely hadn't been there before. The most shocking discovery was in my home office, where Brandon had apparently held some kind of party. My desk was covered with sticky rings from drinks, important papers were scattered across the floor, and someone had tried to break into my filing cabinet using what looked like a screwdriver. The safe was untouched, but everything around it showed clear signs of tampering and disrespect. Sarah stood in the center of this chaos wearing a black dress like she was attending a funeral, which I suppose, in a way, she was. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something calculating in her expression that made me realize this entire scene was carefully orchestrated. She wasn't just hurt, she was performing hurt for an audience. When I started gathering my clothes from the bedroom, Sarah followed me with her entire family in tow, creating this bizarre procession through my own house. Patricia kept making loud comments about how disappointed she was in my behavior, while Monica filmed everything with her phone, apparently planning to create some kind of social media evidence of my harassment. Then came the moment I realized how deep the manipulation went. Sarah positioned herself in the center of the living room, surrounded by her family, like she was holding court, and demanded that I publicly apologize to Brandon for falsely accusing him of theft. According to her, this apology needed to happen in front of witnesses so that everyone could see me taking responsibility for my mistakes. Brandon sat there with this expression of pure smugness, clearly enjoying the show. When I refused to apologize for correctly identifying theft, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope that she'd obviously prepared in advance. Inside were divorce papers already filled out and ready for my signature. Her lawyer was present too, a sharp-dressed woman named Janet Morrison who specialized in high-asset divorces. The divorce demands were breathtaking in their scope and audacity. Sarah wanted half of everything I owned, including my construction business that I'd built years before we even met. She wanted alimony child support for Brandon, despite him being 17 and not my biological child, and she wanted to keep the house while I continued paying the mortgage. According to Janet, these were reasonable requests, given my pattern of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. But the real gut punch came when Brandon decided to twist the knife. He looked directly at me with this satisfied smirk and casually mentioned that he'd spent the stolen money on his girlfriend Ashley, who was sitting right there in my living room wearing a diamond necklace that probably cost $1,500 alone. Ashley gave me this little wave and thanked Brandon for being such a generous boyfriend. The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. Not only had Brandon stolen money meant for my dying sister's medical treatment, but he'd spent it on jewelry for a girl who was now flaunting the theft in my own home. Sarah and her family saw nothing wrong with this because, according to them, Brandon was just a kid trying to make his girlfriend happy. That's when Patricia decided to deliver what she thought would be the killing blow. She pointed her finger at me and declared that I was destroying this family with my selfishness and control issues. According to her, Brandon was a good kid who'd made a small mistake, and my refusal to forgive and move on proved I was never meant to be part of their family anyway. Monica kept filming, making comments about how this video would show everyone what kind of person I really was. She talked about posting it online with captions about emotional abuse and financial control, confident that social media would rally to Sarah's cause. The fact that they were documenting Brandon's admission to theft seemed to escape their notice entirely. My phone rang in the middle of this circus, and when I saw Emma's name on the screen, my heart sank. Her doctor was calling through her phone to explain that they needed the money within 48 hours, or they'd have to give her treatment slot to another patient. The experimental therapy program had a waiting list of cancer patients, and delays meant Emma would have to wait months for another opportunity. Sarah overheard the conversation, and her response revealed everything I needed to know about who she really was. Instead of showing any sympathy or remorse, she suggested that maybe I should have thought about Emma's treatment before starting this drama over money. According to Sarah, my sister's cancer was unfortunate, but it didn't give me the right to accuse innocent people of theft. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what Sarah had just said. Even her own family looked uncomfortable with the casual cruelty of dismissing a cancer patient's need for treatment. But Sarah doubled down, arguing that Brandon's happiness was more important than funding medical procedures for people who might not survive anyway. That's when the final piece of Sarah's plan revealed itself. Marcus Webb, my biggest business competitor, walked through my front door like he owned the place. Marcus was a construction contractor who'd been undercutting my bids and stealing my clients for years through a combination of corner cutting and personal sabotage. Seeing him put his arm around Sarah's waist made everything click into place. Marcus had been feeding Sarah information about my business finances, helping her understand exactly how much my company was worth and how to position herself for the biggest possible divorce settlement. Their affair explained why Sarah had been asking Jake such specific questions about our contracts and profit margins. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. It was a coordinated business attack disguised as a domestic dispute. Sarah and Marcus exchanged this look of satisfaction, clearly believing they'd checkmated me completely. According to their plan, I would either apologize and accept Brandon's theft, proving I could be manipulated and controlled, or I'd divorce Sarah and lose half my business to her and Marcus. Either way, they thought they'd won. But looking around that room, seeing my stolen money being worn as jewelry by a teenage thief's girlfriend, watching my wife embrace the man who'd been sabotaging my business, I realized something important. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to stop playing entirely. The next few weeks brought a cascade of professional disasters that Marcus and Sarah had clearly orchestrated together. My biggest client, a luxury home developer named Robert Chen, suddenly canceled a $200,000 contract, citing concerns about my personal instability, affecting project reliability. When I asked for specifics, Robert mentioned rumors about domestic violence allegations and financial irregularities that could damage his company's reputation. Marcus wasted no time capitalizing on my misfortune, immediately bidding on the same project at rates so low he had to be operating at a loss. But that was the point. He wasn't just trying to build houses. He was trying to destroy my business reputation so thoroughly that Sarah could claim my company was worthless during divorce proceedings, while he absorbed my client base. Sarah and Marcus made their relationship public with social media posts that felt like deliberate provocations. Photos of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and Marcus giving Sarah jewelry that probably cost more than most people's car payments. The message was clear: Sarah had upgraded to a more successful man who appreciated her properly. Brandon became increasingly emboldened by his mother's protection and her new boyfriend's encouragement. He vandalized my work truck twice, first with spray paint that spelled out "thief" across the driver's side door, then by slashing 2 tires while I was meeting with a potential client. Security cameras caught him both times, but Sarah claimed he was just acting out due to the stress of our divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Emma's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The conventional treatments weren't working as well as doctors had hoped, and the experimental therapy program was her last realistic chance for survival. I sold my motorcycle, a restored 1967 Harley-Davidson that had belonged to my father, just to raise enough money for Emma's immediate medical needs. I also sold most of my personal tools, keeping only the basic equipment needed to continue working. The one bright spot in this nightmare was my construction crew's loyalty. Jake Tommy Rodriguez and Billy Carson had all worked with me for years, building relationships based on fair treatment and shared success. When Marcus approached them with job offers at supposedly higher wages, they turned him down flat. They'd seen how Marcus treated his employees, and they understood that short-term money wasn't worth long-term misery. But loyalty doesn't pay bills. and I was facing the real possibility of having to close my business if I couldn't replace the contracts Marcus had stolen. That's when I made the decision to hire a private investigator named Helen Rodriguez, Tommy's sister, who specialized in corporate fraud and personal background checks. If Sarah and Marcus thought they could destroy my life based on lies and manipulation, I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with. Helen's initial findings were devastating, but not surprising. Brandon had been arrested twice for shoplifting in the past year, incidents that Sarah had covered up by paying restitution and agreeing to counseling that Brandon never actually attended. The thefts weren't small either. Brandon had stolen nearly $1,000 worth of electronics and designer clothes, showing a pattern of entitlement and disregard for consequences. Marcus's background was even more revealing. Helen discovered that he'd destroyed 3 previous business partnerships through similar tactics, using personal relationships to gather insider information before launching targeted attacks on competitors. 2 of his former partners had filed lawsuits that were settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, but the pattern was unmistakable. Most shocking of all was Sarah's financial situation, which was far worse than she'd let me believe. She had maxed out credit cards totaling nearly $40,000 in debt, most of it hidden from me during our marriage. Her real estate career was struggling because she'd developed a reputation for overpromising and underdelivering to clients who expected miracles in a competitive market. But Helen's investigation revealed something that changed my perspective on everything that had happened. Brandon wasn't just stealing from me. He'd been systematically stealing from his own mother for months. Sarah's credit cards were maxed out partly because Brandon had been using them for online purchases, expensive restaurants, and cash advances that he told her were for school expenses. The stolen $2,000 from my safe wasn't Brandon's first major theft. It was simply the largest single amount he'd managed to access. Sarah's defensive reaction wasn't just about protecting her son. It was about avoiding the admission that she'd completely lost control of his behavior and her own finances. Marcus was beginning to understand what he'd gotten himself into. Dating a woman with a teenage thief for a son and tens of thousands in hidden debt wasn't the prize he'd thought he was winning. Helen observed several heated conversations between Sarah and Marcus about money, with Marcus clearly pressuring Sarah to resolve her financial situation before it became his problem. The pressure was showing on Brandon, too. Ashley had broken up with him after discovering that the expensive gifts he'd bought her were purchased with stolen money. She kept all the jewelry and clothes, but she made sure everyone at school knew exactly how Brandon had obtained the money to buy them. His reputation went from enviable boyfriend to pathetic thief almost overnight. Around this time, Emma received an anonymous donation that covered her entire experimental treatment program. The money appeared in a special medical fund that the hospital maintained for exactly these situations, and while the donor insisted on remaining unnamed, Emma's doctor said the person had specifically requested that Emma Martinez be given priority treatment. I suspected Jake might have organized a collection among our subcontractors and suppliers, but he denied any involvement. Whoever had helped Emma understood the urgency of her situation and had the resources to make a significant difference. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope that my sister might actually survive. Helen's most damaging discovery came from school security footage that showed Brandon dealing drugs in the school parking lot. The transactions were small, mostly selling marijuana and prescription pills to classmates, but the evidence was clear enough that police were already building a case. Brandon had been using money stolen from both me and Sarah to purchase drugs, then selling them at a profit to fund his increasingly expensive lifestyle. This revelation explained Brandon's confident attitude and expensive possessions. He wasn't just spending stolen money, he'd turned theft into a business model that funded ongoing criminal activity. Sarah's protection wasn't just enabling bad behavior, it was allowing her son to become a genuine criminal. The school investigation was moving forward regardless of what Sarah wanted. Teachers had noticed Brandon's sudden wealth and attitude changes, and several parents had complained about drug activity involving their children. Brandon was about to face consequences that no amount of maternal protection could prevent. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing construction blueprints in my hotel room. It was Principal Nancy Foster from Brandon's high school informing me that Brandon had been arrested on campus for drug dealing and that Sarah had listed me as an emergency contact. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had spent weeks painting me as a dangerous influence on Brandon, but when real trouble arrived, she still expected me to help clean up the mess. Brandon was caught during a sting operation that police had been planning for weeks. Undercover officers had observed him selling prescription painkillers, marijuana, and what appeared to be stolen electronics to fellow students. The arrest happened in front of dozens of witnesses during lunch period, ensuring that Brandon's criminal activity became the talk of the entire school. Sarah arrived at the police station looking shell-shocked and desperate, clearly unprepared for this level of serious legal consequences. She kept insisting there had been some mistake, that Brandon was a good kid who'd been influenced by bad friends. But the evidence was overwhelming. Drugs, cash, stolen merchandise, and security footage showing multiple transactions over several weeks. Marcus was notably absent from the police station, and when Sarah called him repeatedly, his responses grew shorter and more distant. Dating a woman with financial problems had been manageable, but being associated with a drug dealer stepson crossed a line that Marcus wasn't willing to approach. His absence during Sarah's crisis spoke volumes about the depth of their relationship. The arrest triggered a domino effect that Sarah clearly hadn't anticipated. Brandon was immediately expelled from school, facing not just criminal charges, but also the loss of his senior year and graduation prospects. College plans, which Sarah had been boasting about for months, evaporated overnight. More importantly, the arrest became public record, meaning Sarah's real estate clients would inevitably learn about her son's criminal activity. Sarah called me from the police station, her voice shaking with panic and desperation. She begged me to help with Brandon's legal fees, to use my business connections to find him a good lawyer, to somehow make this problem disappear. When I reminded her that she'd emptied our bank account and threatened to destroy my business, she broke down completely. For the first time since our marriage began falling apart, Sarah admitted that she'd made terrible mistakes. She acknowledged that enabling Brandon's behavior had led directly to this moment, and she finally seemed to understand that protecting him from consequences hadn't been protection at all. But even in crisis, her pride prevented her from fully accepting responsibility. I offered to help Brandon, but only under specific conditions. Sarah would have to publicly acknowledge that Brandon had stolen money from me, that her accusations of financial abuse were false, and that she'd been wrong to demand an apology. She'd also have to commit to getting Brandon real help, including drug counseling and restitution for his theft victims. Sarah's response revealed that despite everything that had happened, she still couldn't accept the fundamental reality that her son was a criminal who needed serious intervention. She wanted my help, but without admitting fault or accepting accountability. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, choosing pride over her son's welfare. Marcus officially broke up with Sarah via text message the next day, citing the need to reevaluate their relationship in light of recent developments. Several of Sarah's real estate clients canceled their contracts within hours of Brandon's arrest being reported in the local newspaper. Her mother, Patricia, and sister Monica, who had been so supportive during the divorce proceedings, suddenly became unavailable when Sarah needed emotional support. The financial pressure on Sarah intensified rapidly. Without Marcus's financial support, and with her real estate income disappearing, she couldn't afford Brandon's legal fees or even basic household expenses. The house she'd fought so hard to keep was now a financial burden she couldn't manage alone, and foreclosure notices began arriving within weeks. Brandon's drug dealing had been more extensive than anyone realized. Police discovered that he'd been selling stolen prescription medications that belonged to elderly patients at the nursing home where Ashley's mother worked. The theft victims included vulnerable seniors who depended on pain medications for chronic conditions, adding elder abuse charges to Brandon's growing legal problems. The most devastating revelation came during a family dinner at Patricia's house, where Sarah had brought Brandon hoping to rebuild family relationships. Security cameras that Patricia had installed for home protection captured Brandon stealing money from his own grandmother's purse while she was in the kitchen preparing dessert. The theft was casual and confident, suggesting this wasn't his first time stealing from family members. Patricia discovered the theft immediately when she went to tip the delivery driver and found her wallet empty. When confronted, Brandon initially denied everything until Patricia showed him the security footage. His response was to shrug and claim he'd planned to pay it back eventually, showing no genuine remorse or understanding of why stealing from his grandmother was particularly heinous. This incident finally opened Patricia's eyes to what I'd been trying to tell everyone for months. Brandon wasn't a good kid making occasional mistakes. He was a chronic thief who'd learned to manipulate family members into protecting him from consequences. Patricia's support for Sarah evaporated instantly, replaced by anger at being deceived and disappointment in her daughter's judgment. Monica, who had been filming everything during the divorce confrontation, found herself in an awkward position when her own teenage daughter asked pointed questions about Brandon's behavior. Explaining to a 15-year-old why theft and drug dealing were acceptable for their cousin, but not for her, became impossible, forcing Monica to confront the contradictions in her family's defense of Brandon. Meanwhile, my construction business was experiencing an unexpected renaissance. Word had spread through the community about my integrity during the divorce proceedings, and several potential clients specifically sought me out because they'd heard I was someone who stood by his principles even when it cost me personally. The contrast with Marcus's reputation for cutting corners and questionable business practices became stark when two of his recent projects required expensive repairs due to shoddy workmanship. Emma's cancer treatment was progressing better than doctors had initially hoped. The experimental therapy was showing promising results, and while recovery would be a long process, the immediate crisis had passed. She called me regularly to express gratitude for the mysterious donation that had saved her life, and I could hear strength returning to her voice with each conversation. The investigation into Marcus's business practices was expanding as well. Helen had connected him to a pattern of bid manipulation and client theft that involved forged documents and fraudulent contractor licensing claims. The State Construction Board was reviewing his credentials, and several former clients were considering lawsuits for substandard work that had caused expensive property damage. Sarah's isolation became complete when her real estate license was suspended, pending an ethics investigation. Complaints about her behavior during the divorce proceedings, combined with questions about her judgment regarding Brandon's criminal activity, created a professional crisis that matched her personal disasters. Without income and facing mounting legal bills, Sarah's financial situation became desperate. Brandon returned from juvenile detention with court-mandated community service and drug counseling requirements, but his attitude remained unchanged. He blamed everyone except himself for his situation. Me for starting trouble about money, his mother for not protecting him better, Marcus for abandoning them, and the school system for targeting him unfairly. The victim mentality that Sarah had cultivated in him prevented any genuine reflection or growth. 3 months after Brandon's arrest, Sarah appeared at my construction site looking like a completely different person. Gone was the confident real estate agent who'd once commanded attention in every room. Instead, I saw a woman who'd aged years and months, wearing clothes that had seen better days, and carrying herself with the defeated posture of someone who'd run out of options. She stood at the edge of the construction zone, clearly nervous about approaching me directly. My crew noticed her first, with Jake nudging me and nodding toward the woman who'd caused so much trouble for all of us. Tommy and Billy stopped their work, probably expecting another confrontation, but Sarah's body language suggested something entirely different this time. I walked over to where she waited, and for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, Sarah looked me directly in the eyes without anger or defiance. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked if we could talk privately. Behind her, Brandon sat in an old Honda Civic that I didn't recognize, staring at his hands and looking nothing like the smug teenager who'd once taunted me in my own living room. Sarah began by acknowledging what she should have said months earlier: she'd been wrong about everything. Brandon had indeed stolen money from me. Her accusations of financial abuse were false, and her demand for an apology had been completely inappropriate. More importantly, she admitted that her efforts to protect Brandon from consequences had actually enabled him to become worse, not better. The next 30 minutes brought a confession that was painful to hear, but necessary for any kind of healing to begin. Sarah explained how Brandon's criminal activity had started small, with occasional shoplifting and lying about expenses, but had escalated when she chose to cover for him rather than enforce consequences. Each time she'd paid restitution or made excuses for his behavior, she'd taught him that actions didn't have real repercussions. Brandon had been stealing from her for over a year, using her credit cards for online purchases and taking cash from her purse with increasing boldness. The $40,000 in debt I'd discovered wasn't all from Brandon's spending, but a significant portion resulted from her attempts to cover his theft and maintain the appearance that everything was fine. She'd been living in denial about the severity of his problems while enabling them to grow worse. The relationship with Marcus had been Sarah's attempt to escape the financial pressure of Brandon's behavior. Marcus had initially seemed like a solution to her problems, a successful man who could provide stability while she figured out how to handle her son's issues. But when Brandon's criminal activity became public, Marcus revealed his true character by abandoning them both without hesitation. Sarah's family had turned against her as well, particularly after Brandon stole from his grandmother. Patricia had made it clear that neither Sarah nor Brandon was welcome in her home, until Brandon made full restitution and demonstrated genuine change. Monica was dealing with questions from her own teenage children about why their aunt had defended a drug dealer, creating family tensions that extended far beyond Sarah's immediate problems. The loss of her real estate license meant Sarah was working part-time retail jobs just to pay basic expenses. The house she'd fought so hard to keep was in foreclosure, and her car had been repossessed the week before, forcing her to borrow the Honda from a former co-worker who'd taken pity on her situation. The pride that had once prevented her from acknowledging mistakes now seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. But the most significant change was in Brandon himself, who finally seemed to understand the scope of consequences his actions had created. Sarah brought him over to where we were talking, and for the first time since I'd known him, Brandon looked me in the eye and offered a genuine apology. He admitted to stealing the money meant for Emma's medical treatment, acknowledged that his drug dealing had endangered other students, and expressed understanding that his actions had hurt multiple people. Brandon's confession revealed the depth of his criminal activity. He'd been stealing prescription medications from elderly residents at the nursing home where Ashley's mother worked, selling them to classmates who then sold them to adults for higher profits. The network he'd created had supplied drugs to dozens of people, including some who'd suffered overdoses that could have been fatal. The weight of nearly causing someone's death through his drug dealing had finally broken through Brandon's defenses. He described the moment when police explained how his stolen medications had contributed to a 17-year-old girl's hospitalization, and how that realization had forced him to confront what he'd become. For the first time in his life, Brandon seemed to understand that his actions affected real people in serious ways. Jake, who'd been listening from a distance, approached our conversation and surprised everyone by suggesting we give them a chance to prove they'd changed. He pointed out that everyone deserves an opportunity for redemption and that Brandon's apparent remorse seemed genuine. Tommy and Billy nodded in agreement, perhaps recognizing something in Brandon's situation that resonated with their own experiences. Emma had been encouraging me toward forgiveness as well. Her near-death experience had given her perspective on what really mattered in life, and she'd argued that holding on to anger was more destructive for me than for the people who'd wronged me. She suggested that helping Brandon and Sarah rebuild their lives might be more satisfying than watching them suffer the consequences of their mistakes. I found myself facing a decision that would define not just my relationship with Sarah and Brandon, but my own character moving forward. I could continue letting them face the consequences of their actions alone, which would be completely justified given what they'd put me through. Or I could take the risk of offering help, knowing they might disappoint me again, but potentially creating an opportunity for genuine transformation. Looking at Brandon, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine fear about his future and real remorse for his past actions. His juvenile record would follow him for years, his educational opportunities were severely limited, and his reputation in the community was destroyed. But at 17, he still had time to change direction if someone was willing to help guide him toward better choices. I offered Brandon a job on my construction crew, but with conditions that were non-negotiable. He'd work the hardest, dirtiest jobs for minimum wage until he'd paid back every dollar he'd stolen from me and everyone else. He'd submit to random drug testing, attend counseling sessions, and complete his GED while working full-time. Any violation of these terms would result in immediate termination and no further help from me. For Sarah, I offered assistance in finding legitimate work and rebuilding her reputation, but not as a pathway back to our marriage. That relationship was permanently overdamaged beyond any possibility of repair. However, I was willing to help her become the kind of mother Brandon needed, someone who could provide guidance without enabling destructive behavior. The most surprising moment came when Ashley appeared during our conversation, accompanied by a new boyfriend who clearly had more money than sense. She approached Brandon with obvious intention to humiliate him further, making comments about his legal troubles and reduced circumstances. But instead of reacting with anger or embarrassment, Brandon thanked her for teaching him an important lesson about the difference between people who care about you and people who care about what you can give them. Ashley's confusion at this response was obvious. She'd expected to provoke Brandon into an outburst that would entertain her new boyfriend. Instead, Brandon's calm acceptance of responsibility and refusal to engage with her manipulation left her looking petty and cruel. The new boyfriend seemed uncomfortable with Ashley's behavior, perhaps recognizing the kind of person he was dating. This interaction demonstrated more clearly than any apology that Brandon had genuinely changed. The angry, entitled teenager who'd once stolen money to impress Ashley had been replaced by someone who understood that real relationships aren't built on expensive gifts or social status. It was the first sign that redemption might actually be possible. 6 months later, I stood on the construction site of the Franklin Community Center, watching Brandon operate a concrete mixer with the focused concentration of someone who'd learned to take pride in honest work. The angry, entitled teenager who'd once stolen money meant for my sister's cancer treatment had transformed into a reliable employee who showed up early and stayed late without complaint. Brandon's transformation hadn't happened overnight, and there had been moments when I questioned whether giving him a second chance was worth the risk. The first few weeks were particularly challenging as Brandon struggled with the physical demands of construction work and the reality that his co-workers knew about his criminal past. But gradually, his consistent effort and genuine remorse won over even the most skeptical crew members. The payback process became a source of motivation rather than resentment for Brandon. Every week, he handed me a portion of his wages to repay the stolen money, and I could see satisfaction in his face as the debt grew smaller. He'd also been making payments to other theft victims, including his grandmother, Patricia, who'd been deeply moved by his commitment to making things right. Sarah had found work with a different real estate firm, starting over as an assistant to rebuild her reputation in the industry. The humbling experience of losing everything had taught her valuable lessons about the difference between protecting her son and enabling him. She attended parenting classes and family counseling sessions, learning to provide support without removing consequences for poor choices. Brandon graduated from community college with an associate degree in construction management, maintaining a 3.8 grade point average while working full-time. His professors were impressed not just with his academic performance, but with his maturity and work ethic. Several classmates who knew nothing about his past considered him a role model for balancing education and employment responsibilities. The youth program Brandon started at the community center became his passion project, focusing on helping teenagers avoid the mistakes he'd made. He spoke honestly about his criminal activity, the consequences he'd faced, and the people he'd hurt through his choices. His willingness to share his failures made him credible with kids who might otherwise dismiss adult warnings about drugs and theft. Sarah's public acknowledgement of her mistakes had been painful but necessary for her growth. At a community meeting focused on teen drug prevention, she spoke candidly about how her enabling behavior had contributed to Brandon's problems. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she accepted responsibility without making excuses or blaming external factors. Marcus's construction business collapsed under the weight of investigations and lawsuits. The state construction board revoked his license after discovering systematic fraud and safety violations. Several former clients sued him for damages, and his reputation became so toxic that he eventually left the state entirely. His downfall served as a reminder that success built on dishonesty and sabotage ultimately destroys itself. Patricia and Monica gradually reconciled with Sarah after witnessing the genuine changes in her family. Patricia was particularly moved when Brandon surprised her on her birthday with a handmade wooden jewelry box he'd crafted in his spare time. The gift represented not just his developing skills, but his understanding that relationships are built through consistent care rather than expensive purchases. Emma's cancer remained in remission, and she'd become one of Brandon's strongest supporters. She often visited the construction sites where we worked, bringing lunch for the crew and offering encouragement to Brandon about his progress. Her forgiveness and friendship meant everything to him, especially knowing that his theft had nearly prevented her from receiving life-saving treatment. The anonymous donation for Emma's medical treatment remained a mystery that I never solved, though I suspected it came from someone who understood the importance of second chances. Whether it was Jake, a generous client, or someone else entirely, the gift had demonstrated that kindness and generosity could triumph over selfishness and greed. My personal life had also taken a positive turn when I met Jessica Norton, an elementary school teacher who volunteered at the community center where Brandon ran his youth program. Jessica was drawn to my story not because I'd been wronged, but because of how I'd chosen to respond to betrayal with integrity rather than revenge. Our relationship developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect. Brandon's enrollment in engineering school represented the culmination of his transformation. The same intelligence that he'd once used for manipulation and theft was now focused on designing structures that would benefit communities for decades. His professors saw tremendous potential in his work, and several construction companies had already expressed interest in offering him internships. Sarah's relationship with Tom Mitchell, a local mechanic, showed her growth in choosing partners based on character rather than financial status. Tom was a steady, honest man who appreciated Sarah's journey toward accountability and supported her efforts to be a better mother. Their relationship was built on openness and shared values rather than the superficial attraction and mutual exploitation that had characterized her affair with Marcus. The house that had once been a source of conflict between us became a symbol of healing when Sarah signed the deed over to Brandon as motivation for his continued good choices. Brandon understood that maintaining the house required consistent work and responsible financial management lessons that would serve him well throughout his life. The most meaningful moment of this entire journey came when Brandon publicly thanked me during his high school graduation ceremony. Despite having been expelled, he'd completed his GED and was graduating with his original class through an alternative program. His speech about second chances, accountability, and the importance of adults who refuse to enable destructive behavior moved the entire audience to standing ovation. Sarah approached me after the graduation ceremony, and for the first time since our divorce, we were able to have a conversation without underlying tension or agenda. She expressed genuine gratitude not for my forgiveness, but for my refusal to compromise my principles when doing so would have been easier. According to her, my unwillingness to apologize for correctly identifying theft had ultimately saved Brandon's future by forcing real consequences. The life lesson that emerged from this painful experience was profound and lasting. True strength isn't about winning arguments or getting revenge, but about maintaining your integrity while helping others find theirs. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the refusal to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes short-term pain. Standing at Brandon's graduation, watching him receive recognition for academic achievement and community service, I realized that my 3 words, "find another husband," had accomplished something I never could have planned. By refusing to participate in Sarah's manipulation and Brandon's entitlement, I'd created space for both of them to confront their problems and choose better paths forward. The construction business thrived as word spread about our commitment to integrity and quality work. Clients sought us out specifically because they'd heard about how we handled personal and professional challenges with consistent character. The reputation for reliability and honesty that I'd nearly lost during the divorce proceedings became stronger than ever. Emma often said that her cancer diagnosis, while terrifying, had taught her what really mattered in life: relationships built on love and honesty, the courage to do right even when it's difficult, and the power of forgiveness to heal wounds that seem impossible to repair. Her perspective influenced my decision to help Brandon and Sarah, and her support made their transformation possible. The youth program at the community center expanded to serve dozens of teenagers who were struggling with similar issues to what Brandon had faced. His combination of personal experience and genuine concern made him effective with kids who might otherwise reject adult guidance. Several parents credited Brandon with helping their children avoid serious mistakes. Today, Brandon is a successful engineering student who works part-time for my construction company while maintaining a scholarship at Colorado State University. Sarah runs her own real estate firm focused on helping families find affordable housing, using her experience with financial difficulties to understand her clients' challenges. Both of them have become advocates for accountability and second chances in our community. The greatest satisfaction comes not from vindication or revenge, but from witnessing the transformation of people who once seemed irredeemably lost in selfishness and manipulation. Brandon's journey from drug dealer to community leader demonstrates that redemption is possible when consequences are paired with support and opportunity. Looking back on that terrible night when Sarah demanded I apologize to her son for correctly identifying theft, I'm grateful I found the strength to say those 3 simple words and walk away. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that refusal seems cruel in the moment. The marriage that ended in betrayal and manipulation gave way to relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. The family that was torn apart by theft and lies was rebuilt on the foundation of accountability and genuine change. The crisis that seemed like the end of everything became the beginning of something better for everyone involved. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and standing up for what's right, even when it meant losing relationships that mattered to you? And sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most important growth, both for ourselves and the people we care about. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about overcoming life's challenges. Share it with someone who might need to hear about the power of maintaining integrity under pressure. And let me know in the comments about a time when standing firm on your principles led to unexpected positive outcomes. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destructive choices. Your integrity today shapes not just your future, but the futures of everyone around you.